This is a continuation of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd by Agatha Christie, comprising chapters 7 through 9. Chapter 7. I Learn My Neighbor's Profession. On the following morning I hurried unforgivably over my round. My excuse can be that I had no very serious cases to attend. On my return, Caroline came into the hall to greet me. "Flora Ackroyd is here," she announced in an excited whisper. "What?" I concealed my surprise as best I could. "She's very anxious to see you. She's been here half an hour." Caroline led the way into our small sitting room, and I followed. Flora was sitting on the sofa by the window. She was in black and she sat nervously twisting her hands together. I was shocked by the sight of her face. All the color had faded away from it, but when she spoke her manner was as composed and resolute as possible. "Dr. Shepherd, I have come to ask you to help me." "Of course he'll help you, my dear," said Caroline. I don't think Flora really wished Caroline to be present at the interview. She would, I am sure, have infinitely preferred to speak to me privately. But she also wanted to waste no time, so she made the best of it. "I want you to come to the Larches with me." "The Larches?" I queried, surprised. "To see that funny little man?" exclaimed Caroline. "Yes, you know who he is, don't you?" "We fancied," I said, "that he might be a retired hairdresser." Flora's blue eyes opened very wide. "Why, he's Hercule Poirot. You know who I mean, the private detective. They say he's done the most wonderful things just like detectives do in books. A year ago he retired and came to live down here. Uncle knew who he was, but he promised not to tell anyone, because Poirot wanted to live quietly without being bothered by people." "So that's who he is," I said slowly. "You've heard of him, of course." "I'm rather an old fogey, as Caroline tells me," I said, "but I have just heard of him." "Extraordinary," commented Caroline. I don't know what she was referring to, possibly her own failure to discover the truth. "You want to go and see him?" I asked slowly. "Now why?" "To get him to investigate this murder, of course," said Caroline sharply. "Don't be so stupid, James." I was not really being stupid. Caroline does not always understand what I am driving at. "Yet you haven't got confidence in Inspector Davis," I went on. "Of course she hasn't," said Caroline. "I haven't either." Anyone would have thought it was Caroline's uncle who had been murdered. "And how do you know he would take up the case?" I asked. "Remember, he has retired from active work." "So that's just it," said Flora simply. "I've got to persuade him." "You are sure you are doing wisely?" I asked gravely. "Of course she is," said Caroline. "I'll go with her myself if she likes." "I'd rather the doctor came with me if you don't mind, Miss Shepherd," said Flora. She knows the value of being direct on certain occasions. Any hints would certainly have been wasted on Caroline.
"You see," she explained, following directness with tact, Dr. Shepherd being the doctor, and having found the body, he would be able to give all the details to Poirot.
"Yes," said Caroline grudgingly, "I see that." I took a turn or two up and down the room. "Flora," I said gravely, "be guided by me. I advise you not to drag this detective into the case." Flora sprang to her feet. The color rushed into her cheeks. "I know why you say that," she cried, "but it's exactly for that reason I'm so anxious to go. You're afraid, but I'm not. I know Ralph better than you do." "Ralph," said Caroline. "What has Ralph got to do with it?" Neither of us heeded her. "Ralph may be weak," continued Flora. "He may have done foolish things in the past, wicked things even, but he wouldn't murder anyone." "No, no," I exclaimed. "I never thought it of him." "Then why did you go to the Three Boars last night?" demanded Flora. "On your way home after Uncle's body was found?" I was momentarily silenced. I had hoped that that visit of mine would remain unnoticed. "How did you know about that?" I countered. "I went there this morning," said Flora. "I heard from the servants that Ralph was staying there." I interrupted her. "You had no idea that he was in King's Abbot?" "No," I was astounded. I couldn't understand it. "I went there and asked for him. They told me what I suppose they told you last night, that he went out about 9 o'clock yesterday evening and never came back." Her eyes met mine defiantly, and as though answering something in my look, she burst out. "Well, why shouldn't he? He might have gone anywhere. He may even have gone back to London." "Leaving his luggage behind?" I asked gently. Flora stamped her foot. "I don't care. There must be a simple explanation." "And that's why you want to go to Hercule Poirot. Isn't it better to leave things as they are? The police don't suspect Ralph in the least, remember. They're working on quite another tack." "But that's just it," cried the girl. "They do suspect him. A man from Cranchester turned up this morning, Inspector Raglan. A horrid, weaselly little man. And I found he had been to the Three Boars this morning before me. They told me all about his having been there, and the questions he had asked. He must think Ralph did it." "That's a change of mind from last night, if so," I said slowly. "He doesn't believe in Davis's theory that it was Parker then." "Parker indeed," said my sister, and snorted. Flora came forward and laid her hand on my arm. "Oh, Dr. Shepherd, let us go at once to this M. Poirot. He will find out the truth." "So my dear Flora," I said gently, laying my hand on hers, "are you quite sure it is the truth we want?" She looked at me, nodding her head gravely. "You're not sure," she said. "I am. I know Ralph better than you do." "Of course he didn't do it," said Caroline, who had been keeping silent with great difficulty. "Ralph may be extravagant, but he's a dear boy and has the nicest manners." I wanted to tell Caroline that large numbers of murderers have had nice manners, but the presence of Flora restrained me. Since the girl was determined, I was forced to give in to her, and we started at once, getting away before my sister was able to fire off any more pronouncements, beginning with her favorite words. Of course. An old woman with an immense Breton cap opened the door of the Larches to us. M. Poirot was at home, it seemed. We were ushered into a little sitting room arranged with formal precision, and there, after the lapse of a minute or so, my friend of yesterday came to us. "Monsieur le Docteur," he said, smiling. "Mademoiselle." He bowed to Flora. "Perhaps," I began, "you have heard of the tragedy which occurred last night." His face grew grave. "But certainly I have heard. It is horrible. I offer Mademoiselle all my sympathy. In what way can I serve you?" "Miss Ackroyd," I said, "wants you to find the murderer," said Flora in a clear voice. "I see," said the little man. "But the police will do that, will they not?" "They might make a mistake," said Flora. "They are on their way to make a mistake now, I think. Please, M. Poirot, won't you help us? If it is a question of money." Poirot held up his hand. "Not that, I beg of you, mademoiselle. Not that I do not care for money." His eyes showed a momentary twinkle. "Money, it means much to me and always has done. No, if I go into this, you must understand one thing clearly. I shall go through with it to the end. The good dog, he does not leave the scent, remember. You may wish that, after all, you had left it to the local police." "I want the truth," said Flora, looking him straight in the eyes. "All the truth?" "All the truth." "Then I accept," said the little man quietly, "and I hope you will not regret those words. Now, tell me all the circumstances." "Dr. Shepherd had better tell you," said Flora. "He knows more than I do." Thus enjoined, I plunged into a careful narrative, embodying all the facts I have previously set down. Poirot listened carefully, inserting a question here and there, but for the most part sitting in silence, his eyes on the ceiling. I brought my story to a close with the departure of the inspector and myself from Fernley Park the previous night. "And now," said Flora, as I finished, "tell him all about Ralph." I hesitated, but her imperious glance drove me on. "You went to this inn, this Three Boars, last night on your way home?" asked Poirot as I brought my tale to a close. "Now exactly why was that?" I paused a moment to choose my words carefully. I thought someone ought to inform the young man of his uncle's death. It occurred to me after I had left Fernley that possibly no one but myself and Mr. Ackroyd were aware that he was staying in the village. Poirot nodded. "Quite so. That was your only motive in going there, eh?" "That was my only motive," I said stiffly. "It was not to, shall we say, reassure yourself about said John Hom." "Reassure myself? And I think, M. le Docteur, that you know very well what I mean, though you pretend not to do so. I suggest that it would have been a relief to you if you had found that Captain Peyton had been at home all the evening." "Not at all," I said sharply. The little detective shook his head at me gravely. "You have not the trust in me of Miss Flora," he said, "but no matter. What we have to look at is this Captain Peyton is missing, under circumstances which call for an explanation. I will not hide from you that the matter looks grave. Still, it may admit of a perfectly simple explanation." "That's just what I keep saying," cried Flora eagerly. Poirot touched no more upon that theme. Instead, he suggested an immediate visit to the local police. He thought it better for Flora to return home, and for me to be the one to accompany him there and introduce him to the officer in charge of the case. We carried out this plan forthwith. We found Inspector Davis outside the police station looking very glum indeed. With him was Colonel Melrose, the chief constable, and another man whom, from Flora's description of Weasley, I had no difficulty in recognizing as Inspector Raglan from Cranchester. And I know Melrose fairly well, and I introduced Poirot to him and explained the situation. The chief constable was clearly vexed, and Inspector Raglan looked as black as thunder. Davis, however, seemed slightly exhilarated by the sight of his superior officer's annoyance. "The case is going to be plain as a pikestaff," said Raglan. "Not the least need for amateurs to come butting in. You'd think any fool would have seen the way things were last night, and then we shouldn't have lost 12 hours. He directed a vengeful glance at poor Davis, who received it with perfect stolidity. "Mr. Ackroyd's family must, of course, do what they see fit," said Colonel Melrose. "But we cannot have the official investigation hampered in any way. I know M. Poirot's great reputation, of course," he added courteously. "The police can't advertise themselves, worse luck," said Raglan. "It was Poirot who saved the situation." "It is true that I have retired from the world," he said. "I never intended to take up a case again. Above all things, I have a horror of publicity. I must beg that in the case of my being able to contribute something to the solution of the mystery, my name may not be mentioned." Inspector Raglan's face lightened a little. "I've heard of some very remarkable successes of yours," observed the colonel, thawing. "I have had much experience," said Poirot quietly. "But most of my successes have been obtained by the aid of the police. I admire enormously your English police. If Inspector Raglan permits me to assist him, I shall be both honored and flattered." The inspector's countenance became still more gracious. Colonel Melrose drew me aside. "From all I hear, this little fellow's done some really remarkable things," he murmured. "We're naturally anxious not to have to call in Scotland Yard. Raglan seems very sure of himself, but I'm not quite certain that I agree with him. You see, I know the parties concerned better than he does. This fellow doesn't seem out after kudos, does he? Would work in with us unobtrusively, eh?" "To the greater glory of Inspector Raglan," I said solemnly. "Well, well," said Colonel Melrose breezily in a louder voice, "we must put you wise to the latest developments. M. Poirot. T." "So thank you," said Poirot. "My friend Dr. Shepherd said something of the butler being suspected." "That's all bunkum," said Raglan instantly. "These high-class servants get in such a funk that they act suspiciously for nothing at all." "The fingerprints," I hinted. "Nothing like Parker's." He gave a faint smile and added, "And yours and Mr. Raymond's don't fit either, Doctor." "What about those of Captain Ralph Peyton?" asked Poirot quietly. I felt a secret admiration for the way he took the bull by the horns. I saw a look of respect creep into the inspector's eye. "I see you don't let the grass grow under your feet, Mr. Poirot. It will be a pleasure to work with you, I'm sure. We're going to take that young gentleman's fingerprints as soon as we can lay hands upon him." "I can't help thinking you're mistaken, Inspector," said Colonel Melrose warmly. "I've known Ralph Peyton from a boy upward. He'd never stoop to murder." "Maybe not," said the inspector tonelessly. "What have you got against him?" I asked. "Went out just on 9 o'clock last night. Was seen in neighborhood of Fernley Park somewhere about 9:30. Not been seen since. Believed to be in serious money difficulties. I've got a pair of his shoes here, shoes with rubber studs in them. He had 2 pairs, almost exactly alike. I'm going up now to compare them with those footmarks. The constable is up there seeing that no one tampers with them." "We'll go at once," said Colonel Melrose. "You and M. Poirot will accompany us, will you not?" We assented and all drove up in the colonel's car. The inspector was anxious to get at once to the footmarks and asked to be put down at the lodge. About halfway up the drive, on the right, a path branched off which led round to the terrace and the window of Ackroyd's study. "Would you like to go with the inspector, M. Poirot?" asked the chief constable, "or would you prefer to examine the study?" Poirot chose the latter alternative. Parker opened the door to us. His manner was smug and deferential, and he seemed to have recovered from his panic of the night before. Colonel Melrose took a key from his pocket, and unlocking the door which led into the lobby, he ushered us through into the study. "Except for the removal of the body, M. Poirot, this room is exactly as it was last night." "And the body was found where?" As precisely as possible, I described Ackroyd's position. The armchair still stood in front of the fire. Poirot went and sat down in it. "The blue letter you speak of, where was it when you left the room?" "Mr. Ackroyd had laid it down on this little table at his right hand." Poirot nodded. Thoroughly. "Except for that, everything was in its place." "Yes, I think so." "Colonel Melrose, would you be so extremely obliging as to sit down in this chair a minute?" "I thank you. Now, Memel Doctor, will you kindly indicate to me the exact position of the dagger?" I did so, whilst the little man stood in the doorway. The hilt of the dagger was plainly visible from the door then. Both you and Parker could see it at once. Yes. Poirot went next to the window. The electric light was on, of course, when you discovered the body? He asked over his shoulder. I assented, and joined him where he was studying the marks on the window sill. The rubber studs are the same pattern as those in Captain Peyton's shoes, he said quietly. Then he came back once more to the middle of the room. His eye traveled round, searching everything in the room with a quick, trained glance. Are you a man of good observation, Dr. Shepherd? He asked at last. I think so, I said, surprised. So there was a fire in the grate, I see. When you broke the door down and found Mr. Ackroyd dead, how was the fire? Was it low? I gave a vexed laugh. I really can't say. I didn't notice. Perhaps Mr. Raymond or Major Blunt. The little man opposite me shook his head with a faint smile. One must always proceed with method. I made an error of judgment in asking you that question. To each man his own knowledge. You could tell me the details of the patient's appearance, nothing there would escape you. If I wanted information about the papers on that desk, Mr. Raymond would have noticed anything there was to see. To find out about the fire, I must ask the man whose business it is to observe such things. You permit. He moved swiftly to the fireplace and rang the bell. After a lapse of a minute or two, Parker appeared. The bell rang, sir, he said hesitatingly. Come in, Parker, said Colonel Melrose. This gentleman wants to ask you something. Parker transferred a respectful attention to Poirot. Parker, said the little man, when you broke down the door with Dr. Shepherd last night and found your master dead, what was the state of the fire? Parker replied without a pause. It had burned very low, sir. It was almost out. Ah, said Poirot. The exclamation sounded almost triumphant. He went on. To look round you, my good Parker. Is this room exactly as it was then? The butler's eye swept round. It came to rest on the windows. The curtains were drawn, sir, and the electric light was on. Poirot nodded approval. Anything else? Yes, sir, this chair was drawn out a little more. He indicated a big grandfather chair to the left of the door between it and the window. I append a plan of the room with the chair in question marked with an X. Just show me, said Poirot. The butler drew the chair in question out a good 2 feet from the wall, turning it so that the seat faced the door. Voiles quies curioux, murmured Poirot. No one would want to sit in a chair in such a position, I fancy. Now who pushed it back into place again, I wonder? Did you, my friend? No, sir, said Parker. I was too upset with seeing the master and all. Poirot looked across at me. Did you, doctor? I shook my head. It was back in position when I arrived with the police, sir, put in Parker. I'm sure of that. Curious, said Poirot again. Raymond or Blunt must have pushed it back, I suggested. Surely it isn't important. It is completely unimportant, said Poirot. That is why it is so interesting, he added softly. Excuse me a minute, said Colonel Melrose. He left the room with Parker. Do you think Parker is speaking the truth? I asked. About the chair? Yes. Otherwise I do not know. You will find, le docteur, if you have much to do with cases of this kind, that they all resemble each other in one thing. What is that? I asked curiously. Everyone concerned in them has something to hide. And have I? I asked, smiling. Poirot looked at me attentively. I think you have, he said quietly. But, have you told me everything known to you about this young man Peyton? He smiled as I grew red. Oh, do not fear. I will not press you. I shall learn it in good time. And I wish you'd tell me something of your methods, I said hastily, to cover my confusion. The point about the fire, for instance? Oh, that was very simple. You leave Mr. Ackroyd at 10 minutes to 9, was it not? Yes, exactly, I should say. The window is then closed and bolted and the door unlocked. At 10:15, when the body is discovered, the door is locked and the window is open. Who opened it? Clearly only Mr. Ackroyd himself could have done so, and for one of two reasons. Either because the room became unbearably hot, but since the fire was nearly out and there was a sharp drop in temperature last night. That cannot be the reason, or because he admitted someone that way. And if he admitted someone that way, it must have been someone well known to him, since he had previously shown himself uneasy on the subject of that same window. It sounds very simple, I said. Everything is simple if you arrange the facts methodically. We are concerned now with the personality of the person who was with him at 9:30 last night. Everything goes to show that that was the individual admitted by the window, and though Mr. Ackroyd was seen alive later by Miss Flora, we cannot approach a solution of the mystery until we know who that visitor was. The window may have been left open after his departure and so afforded entrance to the murderer, or the same person may have returned a second time. Ah, here is the Colonel who returns. Colonel Melrose entered with an animated manner. "That telephone call has been traced at last," he said. "It did not come from here. It was put through to Dr. Shepherd at 10:15 last night from a public call office at King's Abbot Station, and at 10:23 the night mail leaves for Liverpool." Chapter 8. Inspector Raglan is confident. We looked at each other. "You'll have inquiries made at the station, of course," I said. "Naturally, but I'm not over-sanguine as to the result. You know what that station is like?" I did. King's Abbot is a mere village, but its station happens to be an important junction. Most of the big expresses stop there, and trains are shunted, resorted, and made up. It has 2 or 3 public telephone boxes. At that time of night 3 local trains come in close upon each other to catch the connection with the express for the north, which comes in at 10:19 and leaves at 10:23. The whole place is in a bustle, and the chances of one particular person being noticed telephoning or getting into the express are very small indeed. "But why telephone at all?" demanded Melrose. "That is what I find so extraordinary. There seems no rhyme or reason in the thing." Poirot carefully straightened a china ornament on one of the bookcases. "Be sure there was a reason," he said over his shoulder. "But what reason could it be? When we know that, we shall know everything. This case is very curious and very interesting." There was something almost indescribable in the way he said those last words. I felt that he was looking at the case from some peculiar angle of his own, and what he saw I could not tell. "You went to the window and stood there, looking out. You say it was 9 o'clock, Dr. Shepherd, when you met this stranger outside the gate?" He asked the question without turning round. "Yes," I replied. "I heard the church clock chime the hour." "How long would it take him to reach the house to reach this window, for instance?" 5 minutes at the outside. 2 or 3 minutes only if he took the path at the right of the drive and came straight here. But to do that he would have to know the way. How can I explain myself? It would mean that he had been here before, that he knew his surroundings." "That is true," replied Colonel Melrose. "We could find out, doubtless, if Mr. Ackroyd had received any strangers during the past week?" "Young Raymond could tell us that," I said. "Or Parker," suggested Colonel Melrose. "Out Tusley's Dook," suggested Poirot, smiling. Colonel Melrose went in search of Raymond, and I rang the bell once more for Parker. Colonel Melrose returned almost immediately, accompanied by the young secretary, whom he introduced to Poirot. Geoffrey Raymond was fresh and debonair as ever. He seemed surprised and delighted to make Poirot's acquaintance. "No idea you'd been living among us incognito, Mesh Poirot," he said. "It will be a great privilege to watch you at work. Hollow, what's this?" Poirot had been standing just to the left of the door. Now he moved aside suddenly, and I saw that while my back was turned he must have swiftly drawn out the armchair, till it stood in the position Parker had indicated. "I want me to sit in the chair whilst you take a blood test?" asked Raymond good-humoredly. "What's the idea?" "Mere Raymond, this chair was pulled out so last night when Mr. Ackroyd was found killed. Someone moved it back again into place. Did you do so?" The secretary's reply came without a second's hesitation. "No, indeed I didn't. I don't even remember that it was in that position, but it must have been if you say so. Anyway, somebody else must have moved it back to its proper place. Have they destroyed a clue in doing so? Too bad." "It is of no consequence," said the detective. "Of no consequence whatever. What I really want to ask you is this. Raymond, did any stranger come to see Mr. Ackroyd during this past week?" The secretary reflected for a minute or two, knitting his brows, and during the pause Parker appeared in answer to the bell. "No," said Raymond at last. "I can't remember any one. Can you, Parker?" "I beg your pardon, sir?" "Any stranger coming to see Mr. Ackroyd this week?" The butler reflected for a minute or two. "There was the young man who came on Wednesday, sir," he said at last. "From Curtis and Trout, I understood he was." Raymond moved this aside with an impatient hand. "Oh, yes, I remember, but that is not the kind of stranger this gentleman means." He turned to Poirot. "Mr. Ackroyd had some idea of purchasing a dictaphone," he explained. "It would have enabled us to get through a lot more work in a limited time. The firm in question sent down their representative, but nothing came of it. Mr. Ackroyd did not make up his mind to purchase." Poirot turned to the butler. "Can you describe this young man to me, my good Parker?" That he was fair-haired, sir, and short, very neatly dressed in a blue serge suit. A very presentable young man, sir, for his station in life. Poirot turned to me. The man you met outside the gate, doctor, was tall, was he not? Yes, I said. Somewhere about 6 feet, I should say. There is nothing in that, then, declared the Belgian. I thank you, Parker. The butler spoke to Raymond. Mr. Hammond has just arrived, sir, he said. He is anxious to know if he can be of any service, and he would be glad to have a word with you. I'll come at once, said the young man. He hurried out. Poirot looked inquiringly at the chief constable. So the family solicitor, M. Poirot, said the latter. It is a busy time for this young M. Raymond, murmured M. Poirot. He has the air efficient, that one. I believe Mr. Ackroyd considered him a most able secretary. He has been here how long? Just on 2 years, I fancy. His duties he fulfills punctiliously, of that I am sure. In what manner does he amuse himself? Does he go in for le sport? Private secretaries haven't much time for that sort of thing, said Colonel Melrose, smiling. Raymond plays golf, I believe, and tennis in the summer-time. Yet he does not attend the courses, I should say the running of the horses? Race meetings? No, I don't think he's interested in racing. Poirot nodded and seemed to lose interest. He glanced slowly round the study. I have seen, I think, all that there is to be seen here. I, too, looked round. If those walls could speak, I murmured. Poirot shook his head. A tongue is not enough, he said. They would have to have also eyes and ears, but do not be too sure that these dead things he touched the top of the bookcase as he spoke are always dumb. To me they speak sometimes chairs, tables they have their message. He turned away towards the door. What message? I cried. What have they said to you today? He looked over his shoulder and raised one eyebrow quizzically. An opened window, he said. A locked door. A chair that apparently moved itself. To all three I say why, and I find no answer. He shook his head, puffed out his chest, and stood blinking at us. He looked ridiculously full of his own importance. It crossed my mind to wonder whether he was really any good as a detective. Had his big reputation been built up on a series of lucky chances? I think the same thought must have occurred to Colonel Melrose, for he frowned. Anything more you want to see, M. Poirot? He inquired brusquely. You would perhaps be so kind as to show me the silver table from which the weapon was taken. After that, I will trespass on your kindness no longer. And we went to the drawing-room, but on the way the constable waylaid the colonel, and after a muttered conversation the latter excused himself and left us together. So I showed Poirot the silver table, and after raising the lid once or twice and letting it fall, he pushed open the window and stepped out on the terrace. I followed him. Inspector Raglan had just turned the corner of the house, and was coming towards us. His face looked grim and satisfied. So there you are, Miss Poirot, he said. Well, this isn't going to be much of a case. I'm sorry, too. A nice enough young fellow gone wrong. Poirot's face fell, and he spoke very mildly. I'm afraid I shall not be able to be of much aid to you then. Next time, perhaps, said the inspector soothingly. Though we don't have murders every day in this quiet little corner of the world. Poirot's gaze took on an admiring quality. You have been of a marvelous promptness, he observed. How exactly did you go to work, if I may ask? Certainly, said the inspector. To begin with method. That's what I always say, method. Ah, cried the other. That, too, is my watchword. Method, order, and the little gray cells. The cells, said the inspector, staring. The little gray cells of the brain, explained the Belgian. Oh, of course, well, we all use them, I suppose. In a greater or lesser degree, murmured Poirot. And there are, too, differences in quality. Then there is the psychology of a crime. One must study that. Ah, said the inspector, you've been bitten with all this psychoanalysis stuff. Now, I'm a plain man. Mrs. Raglan would not agree, I am sure, to that, said Poirot, making him a little bow. Inspector Raglan, a little taken aback, bowed. You don't understand, he said, grinning broadly. Lord, what a lot of difference language makes. I'm telling you how I set to work. First of all, method. Mr. Ackroyd was last seen alive at 9:45 by his niece, Miss Flora Ackroyd. So that's fact number 1, isn't it? If you say so. Well, it is. At 10:30, the doctor here says that Mr. Ackroyd has been dead at least half an hour. You stick to that, doctor. Certainly, I said. Half an hour or longer. Very good. That gives us exactly a quarter of an hour in which the crime must have been committed. I make a list of every one in the house, and work through it, setting down opposite their names where they were and what they were doing between the hour of 9:45 and 10 p.m. He handed a sheet of paper to Poirot. I read it over his shoulder. It ran as follows, written in a neat script. Major Blunt, in billiard room with Mr. Raymond, latter confirms. Mr. Raymond, billiard room, see above. Mrs. Ackroyd, --9.45 watching billiard match. Went up to bed 9:55. Raymond and Blunt watched her up staircase. Miss Ackroyd went straight from her uncle's room upstairs, confirmed by Parker, also housemaid, Elsie Dale. Servants. Parker went straight to butler's pantry, confirmed by housekeeper, Miss Russell, who came down to speak to him about something at 9:47, and remained at least 10 minutes. Miss Russell, as above, spoke to housemaid Elsie Dale upstairs at 9:45. Ursula Bourne, parlor maid, in her own room until 9:55, then in servants' hall. Mrs. Cooper, cook, in servants' hall. Gladys Jones, second housemaid, in servants' hall. Elsie Dale, upstairs in bedroom, seen there by Miss Russell and Miss Flora Ackroyd. Mary Thripp, kitchen maid, servants' hall. The cook has been here 7 years, the parlor maid 18 months, and Parker just over a year. The others are new. Except for something fishy about Parker, they all seem quite all right. A very complete list, said Poirot, handing it back to him. I am quite sure that Parker did not do the murder, he added gravely. So is my sister, I struck in, and she's usually right. Nobody paid any attention to my interpolation. That disposes pretty effectually of the household, continued the inspector. Now we come to a very grave point. The woman at the lodge, Mary Black, was pulling the curtains last night when she saw Ralph Peyton turn in at the gate and go up towards the house. She is sure of that? I asked sharply. Quite sure. She knows him well by sight. He went past very quickly and turned off by the path to the right, which is a short cut to the terrace. And what time was that? Asked Poirot, who had sat with an immovable face. Exactly 25 minutes past 9, said the inspector gravely. There was a silence. Then the inspector spoke again. It's all clear enough. It fits in without a flaw. At 25 minutes past 9, Captain Peyton is seen passing the lodge. At 9:30 or thereabouts, Mr. Geoffrey Raymond hears someone in here asking for money and Mr. Ackroyd refusing. What happens next? Captain Peyton leaves the same way through the window. He walks along the terrace, angry and baffled. He comes to the open drawing-room window. Say it's now 9:45. Miss Flora Ackroyd is saying good night to her uncle. Major Blunt, Mr. Raymond, and Mrs. Ackroyd are in the billiard room. The drawing room is empty. He steals in, takes the dagger from the silver table, and returns to the study window. He slips off his shoes, climbs in, and well, I don't need to go into details. Then he slips out again and goes off. I hadn't the nerve to go back to the inn. He makes for the station, rings up from there. Why? Said Poirot softly. I jumped at the interruption. The little man was leaning forward. His eyes shone with a queer green light. For a moment Inspector Raglan was taken aback by the question. It's difficult to say exactly why he did that, he said at last, but murderers do funny things. You'd know that if you were in the police force. The cleverest of them make stupid mistakes sometimes. But come along and I'll show you those footprints. We followed him round the corner of the terrace to the study window. At a word from Raglan, a police constable produced the shoes which had been obtained from the local inn. The inspector laid them over the marks. They're the same, he said confidently. That is to say, they're not the same pair that actually made these prints. He went away in those. This is a pair just like them, but older. See how the studs are worn down. Surely a great many people wear shoes with rubber studs in them, asked Poirot. That's so, of course, said the inspector. I shouldn't put so much stress on the footmarks if it wasn't for everything else. A very foolish young man, Captain Ralph Peyton, said Poirot thoughtfully, to leave so much evidence of his presence. Ah, well, said the inspector, it was a dry, fine night, you know. He'd left no prints on the terrace or on the gravelled path. But, unluckily for him, a spring must have welled up just lately at the end of the path from the drive. See here. Small gravelled path joined the terrace a few feet away. In one spot, a few yards from its termination, the ground was wet and boggy. Crossing this wet place, there were again the marks of footsteps, and amongst them the shoes with rubber studs. Poirot followed the path on a little way, the inspector by his side. You noticed the women's footprints, he said suddenly. And the inspector laughed. And naturally, but several different women have walked this way and men as well. It's a regular shortcut to the house, you see. It would be impossible to sort out all the footsteps. After all, it's the ones on the windowsill that are really important. Poirot nodded. It's no good going farther, said the inspector, as we came in view of the drive. It's all graveled again here, and hard as it can be. Again Poirot nodded, but his eyes were fixed on a small garden house, a kind of superior summer house. But it was a little to the left of the path ahead of us, and a graveled walk ran up to it. Poirot lingered about until the inspector had gone back towards the house. Then he looked at me. "You must have indeed been sent from the good God to replace my friend Hastings," he said with a twinkle. "I observe that you do not quit my side. How say you, Dr. Shepherd, shall we investigate that summer house? It interests me." And he went up to the door and opened it. Inside, the place was almost dark. There were 1 or 2 rustic seats, a croquet set, and some folded deck chairs. I was startled to observe my new friend. He had dropped to his hands and knees and was crawling about the floor. And every now and then he shook his head as though not satisfied. Finally, he sat back on his heels. "Nothing," he murmured. "Well, perhaps it was not to be expected, but it would have meant so much." He broke off, stiffening all over. Then he stretched out his hand to one of the rustic chairs. He detached something from one side of it. "What is it?" I cried. "What have you found?" He smiled, unclosing his hand so that I should see what lay in the palm of it. A scrap of stiff white cambric. I took it from him, looked at it curiously, and then handed it back. "What do you make of it, my friend?" he asked, eyeing me keenly. "A scrap torn from a handkerchief," I suggested, shrugging my shoulders. And he made another dart and picked up a small quill, a goose quill by the look of it. "That?" he cried triumphantly. "What do you make of that?" I only stared. He slipped the quill into his pocket and looked again at the scrap of white stuff. "A fragment of a handkerchief," he mused. "Perhaps you are right, but remember this: a good laundry does not starch a handkerchief." He nodded at me triumphantly, then he put away the scrap carefully in his pocketbook. Chapter 9. The Goldfish Pond. So we walked back to the house together. There was no sign of the inspector. Poirot paused on the terrace and stood with his back to the house, slowly turning his head from side to side. "To win belle propriety," he said at last appreciatively. "Who inherits it?" His words gave me almost a shock. It is an odd thing, but until that moment the question of inheritance had never come into my head. Poirot watched me keenly. "It is a new idea to you, that," he said at last. "You had not thought of it before, eh?" "No," I said truthfully. "I wish I had." He looked at me again curiously. "I wonder just what you mean by that," he said thoughtfully. "Ah, no," as I was about to speak. "In Noodle, you would not tell me your real thought." "Everyone has something to hide," I quoted, smiling. "Exactly." "You still believe that?" "More than ever, my friend. But it is not easy to hide things from Hercule Poirot. He has a knack of finding out." And he descended the steps of the Dutch garden as he spoke. "Now let us walk a little," he said over his shoulder. "The air is pleasant today." I followed him. He led me down a path to the left enclosed in yew hedges. A walk led down the middle, bordered each side with formal flower beds, and at the end was a round paved recess with a seat and a pond of goldfish. Instead of pursuing the path to the end, Poirot took another which wound up the side of a wooded slope. In one spot the trees had been cleared away, and a seat had been put. Sitting there one had a splendid view over the countryside, and one looked right down on the paved recess in the goldfish pond. "England is very beautiful," said Poirot, his eyes straying over the prospect. Then he smiled. "And so are English girls," he said in a lower tone. "Hush, my friend, and look at the pretty picture below us." It was then that I saw Flora. She was moving along the path we had just left, and she was humming a little snatch of song. Her step was more dancing than walking, and in spite of her black dress, there was nothing but joy in her whole attitude. She gave a sudden pirouette on her toes, and her black draperies swung out. At the same time she flung her head back and laughed outright. As she did so, a man stepped out from the trees. It was Hector Blunt. The girl started. Her expression changed a little. "How you startled me, I didn't see you." Blunt said nothing, but stood looking at her for a minute or two in silence. "What I like about you," said Flora, with a touch of malice, "is your cheery conversation." I fancied that Blunt reddened under his tan. His voice, when he spoke, sounded different. It had a curious sort of humility in it. "Never was much of a fellow for talking, not even when I was young." "That was a very long time ago, I suppose," said Flora gravely. I caught the undercurrent of laughter in her voice, but I don't think Blunt did. "Yes," he said simply, "it was." How does it feel to be Methuselah? Asked Flora. This time the laughter was more apparent, but Blunt was following out an idea of his own. I remember the Johnny who sold his soul to the devil, in return for being made young again. There's an opera about it. Faust, you mean? You mean? That's the beggar. Rum story. Some of us would do it if we could. Anyone would think you were creaking at the joints to hear you talk, cried Flora, half vexed, half amused. Blunt said nothing for a minute or two. Then he looked away from Flora into the middle distance, and observed to an adjacent tree trunk that it was about time he got back to Africa. Are you going on another expedition shooting things? Expect so. Usually do, shoot things I mean. You shot that head in the hall, didn't you? Blunt nodded. Then he jerked out, going rather red as he did so. Care for some decent skins any time. If so, I could get 'em for you. Oh, please do, cried Flora. Will you really? You won't forget? I shan't forget, said Hector Blunt. He added, in a sudden burst of communicativeness. Time I went. I'm no good in this sort of life. Haven't got the manners for it. I'm a rough fellow, no use in society. We never remember the things one's expected to say. Yes, time I went. But you're not going at once, cried Flora. Not while we're in all this trouble. Oh, please, if you go. She turned away a little. You want me to stay? Asked Blunt. He spoke deliberately but quite simply. We all, essentially, I meant you personally, said Blunt with directness. Flora turned slowly back again and met his eyes. I want you to stay, she said, if that makes any difference. It makes all the difference, said Blunt. There was a moment's silence. They sat down on the stone seat by the goldfish pond. It seemed as though neither of them knew quite what to say next. It's such a lovely morning, said Flora at last. I can't help feeling happy, in spite of everything. That's awful, I suppose. Quite natural, said Blunt. Never saw your uncle until 2 years ago, did you? Can't be expected to grieve very much. Much better to have no humbug about it. There's something awfully consoling about you, said Flora. You make things so simple. Things are simple as a rule, said the big game hunter. Not always, said Flora. Her voice had lowered itself, and I saw Blunt turn and look at her, bringing his eyes back from, apparently, the coast of Africa to do so. He evidently put his own construction on her change of tone, for he said, after a minute or two in rather an abrupt manner. I say, you mustn't worry. About that young chap, I mean. Inspector's an ass. Everybody knows utterly absurd to think he could have done it. Man from outside. Burglar chap. That's the only possible solution. Flora turned to look at him. You really think so? Don't you? Said Blunt quickly. Oh yes, of course. Another silence, and then Flora burst out. I'll tell you why I felt so happy this morning. However heartless you think me, I'd rather tell you. It's because the lawyer has been Mr. Hammond. He told us about the will. Uncle Roger has left me £20,000. I think of it 20,000 beautiful pounds. Blunt looked surprised. Does it mean so much to you? You mean much to me. Why, it's everything. Freedom, life, no more scheming and scraping and lying. Lying, said Blunt, sharply interrupting. Flora seemed taken aback for a minute. You know what I mean, she said uncertainly. Pretending to be thankful for all the nasty cast-off things rich relations give you. Last year's coats and skirts and hats. Don't know much about ladies' clothes, should have said you were always very well turned out. It's cost me something, though, said Flora in a low voice. Don't let's talk of horrid things. I'm so happy. I'm free. Free to do what I like. Free not to. She stopped suddenly. Not to what? Asked Blunt quickly. I forget now. Nothing important. A Blunt had a stick in his hand, and he thrust it into the pond, poking at something. What are you doing, Major Blunt? There's something bright down there. Wondered what it was. Looks like a gold brooch. Now, I've stirred up the mud, and it's gone. Perhaps it's a crown, suggested Flora. Like the one Melisande saw in the water. Melisande, said Blunt reflectively. She's in an opera, isn't she? Yes, you seem to know a lot about operas. People take me sometimes, said Blunt sadly. Funny idea of pleasure worse racket than the natives make with their tom-toms. Flora laughed. I remember Melisande, continued Blunt, married an old chap old enough to be her father. And he threw a small piece of flint to the goldfish pond. Then, with a change of manner, he turned to Flora. Miss Ackroyd, can I do anything? About Peyton, I mean. I know how dreadfully anxious you must be." "Thank you," said Flora in a cold voice. "There is really nothing to be done. Ralph will be all right. And I've got hold of the most wonderful detective in the world, and he's going to find out all about it." For some time I had felt uneasy as to our position. We were not exactly eavesdropping, since the two in the garden below had only to lift their heads to see us. Nevertheless, I should have drawn attention to our presence before now, had not my companion put a warning pressure on my arm. Clearly he wished me to remain silent. But now he rose briskly to his feet, clearing his throat. "And I demand pardon," he cried. "I cannot allow mademoiselle thus extravagantly to compliment me and not draw attention to my presence. Till they say the listener hears no good of himself, but that is not the case this time. To spare my blushes, I must join you and apologize." He hurried down the path with me close behind him and joined the others by the pond. "This is M. Hercule Poirot," said Flora. "I expect you've heard of him." Poirot bowed. "I know Major Blunt by reputation," he said politely. "I am glad to have encountered you, monsieur. So I am in need of some information that you can give me." Blunt looked at him inquiringly. "When did you last see Ackroyd alive?" "At dinner." "And you neither saw nor heard anything of him after that?" "Didn't see him. Heard his voice." "How was that?" "I strolled out on the terrace." "Pardon me, what time was this?" "About 9:30. I was walking up and down smoking in front of the drawing-room window. I heard Ackroyd talking in his study." Poirot stooped and removed a microscopic weed. "Surely you couldn't hear voices in the study from that part of the terrace," he murmured. But he was not looking at Blunt, but I was, and to my intense surprise, I saw the latter flush. "I went as far as the corner," he explained unwillingly. "Ah, indeed," said Poirot. In the mildest manner he conveyed an impression that more was wanted. "Thought I saw a woman disappearing into the bushes, just a gleam of white, you know. I must have been mistaken. It was while I was standing at the corner of the terrace that I heard Ackroyd's voice speaking to that secretary of his. Speaking to Mr. Geoffrey Raymond. So yes, that's what I supposed at the time. Seems I was wrong. Mr. Ackroyd didn't address him by name." "Oh, no." "Then, if I may ask, why did you think?" Blunt explained laboriously. "I took it for granted that it would be Raymond, because he had said just before I came out that he was taking some papers to Ackroyd. Never thought of it being anybody else." "Can you remember what the words you heard were?" "Afraid I can't. Something quite ordinary and unimportant. Only caught a scrap of it. I was thinking of something else at the time." "It is of no importance," murmured Poirot. "Did you move a chair back against the wall when you went into the study after the body was discovered?" "Chair? No, why should I?" Poirot shrugged his shoulders but did not answer. He turned to Flora. "There is one thing I should like to know from you, mademoiselle. When you were examining the things in the silver table with Dr. Shepherd, was the dagger in its place, or was it not?" Flora's chin shot up. "Inspector Raglan has been asking me that," she said resentfully. "I've told him and I'll tell you. I'm perfectly certain the dagger was not there. He thinks it was and that Ralph sneaked it later in the evening. And then he doesn't believe me. He thinks I'm saying it to shield Ralph." "And aren't you?" I asked gravely. Flora stamped her foot. "You, too, Dr. Shepherd. Oh, it's too bad." Poirot tactfully made a diversion. "It is true what I heard you say, Major Blunt. There is something that glitters in this pond. Let us see if I can reach it." He knelt down by the pond, baring his arm to the elbow, and lowered it in very slowly, so as not to disturb the bottom of the pond. But in spite of all his precautions, the mud eddied and swirled, and he was forced to draw his arm out again empty-handed. He gazed ruefully at the mud upon his arm. I offered him my handkerchief, which he accepted with fervent protestations of thanks. Blunt looked at his watch. "Nearly lunchtime," he said. "We'd better be getting back to the house." "You will lunch with us, M. Poirot?" asked Flora. "I should like you to meet my mother. She is very fond of Ralph." The little man bowed. "I shall be delighted, mademoiselle." "And you will stay, too, won't you, Dr. Shepherd?" I hesitated. "Oh, do." I wanted to, so I accepted the invitation without further ceremony. We set out towards the house, Flora and Blunt walking ahead. "What hair?" said Poirot to me in a low tone, nodding towards Flora. "The real gold. They will make a pretty couple. She and the dark, handsome Captain Peyton, will they not?" I looked at him inquiringly, but he began to fuss about a few microscopic drops of water on his coat sleeve. The man reminded me in some ways of a cat, his green eyes and his finicking habits. And all for nothing too, I said sympathetically. I wonder what it was in the pond. Would you like to see? Asked Poirot. I stared at him. He nodded. My good friend, he said gently and reproachfully, Hercule Poirot does not run the risk of disarranging his costume without being sure of attaining his object. To do so would be ridiculous and absurd. I am never ridiculous. But you brought your hand out empty, I objected. There are times when it is necessary to have discretion. Do you tell your patients everything, doctor? I think not. Nor do you tell your excellent sister everything either, is it not so? Before showing my empty hand, I dropped what it contained into my other hand. You shall see what that was. He held out his left hand, palm open. On it lay a little circlet of gold, a woman's wedding ring. I took it from him. Look inside, commanded Poirot. I did so. Inside was an inscription in fine writing. From R, March 13th. I looked at Poirot, but he was busy inspecting his appearance in a tiny pocket glass. He paid particular attention to his mustaches, and none at all to me. I saw that he did not intend to be communicative. This concludes the third part of 7 total of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd by Agatha Christie, produced by Best Audiobooks for free.